It happened quietly, almost casually. A weekend operation, a foreign president seized, and suddenly the world felt smaller and far more dangerous. I'm Fareed Zakaria, and what followed the Venezuela strike was not a single act of force, but a pattern of power. In just 2 days, President Donald Trump's words reached from Caracas to Greenland, from Bogota to Tehran. Different countries, different continents, one message: American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. This wasn't diplomacy. It wasn't strategy papers or closed-door summits. It was raw public signaling about oil, security, obedience, and consequence. When a U.S. president speaks of needing another country or jokes about operations sounding good, words stop being abstract. They become pressure, they become policy. If you want to understand where global power is heading and how rhetoric turns into reality, stay with me. Because Venezuela was not the story, it was the beginning. And to see what comes next, we need to slow this moment down and examine what exactly is being unleashed. So let's be precise about what we're actually looking at. This is not a random series of outbursts. It is a structured escalation, verbal, political, and strategic, that began the moment U.S. forces seized Venezuela's president. From that point forward, the message expanded outward. Greenland was described as a necessity, Colombia as a problem, Cuba as a regime about to fall, Mexico as a neighbor that must get its act together, Iran as a government that could be hit very hard. Different justifications were offered: national security, oil, drugs, human rights, nuclear threats. But the logic was consistent. The United States reserves the right to decide when another country has crossed a line and to act or threaten to act accordingly. What makes this moment distinct is not the use of force itself. It's the normalization of public coercion. Pressure delivered openly, casually, even rhetorically. To understand why this approach is emerging now, we have to step back into history, power cycles, and America's changing view of its role. To understand this moment, we have to remember that American power has always moved in cycles. After the Cold War, the United States stood alone, militarily dominant, economically unmatched. Intervention was framed as order. Expansion was framed as stability. But over time, restraint crept in. Wars became unpopular. Globalization blurred borders. And American power learned to speak softly even when it carried a very big stick. What we are witnessing now is a reversal of that instinct. The language coming from Washington no longer disguises force behind alliances or institutions. It speaks in mechanisms: oil flows, shipping lanes, cartels, nuclear facilities. Greenland is not described as a people, but as a position. Venezuela is not framed as a nation, but as an oil system. Colombia becomes a cocaine pipeline. Cuba, an economic dependency. Iran, a set of targets. This is power stripped of metaphor. A return to spheres of influence declared out loud. And when systems are reduced this way, crises don't need to be invented. They emerge naturally. The first one arrived almost immediately. The first rupture came not with missiles, but with words. When President Trump described Colombia's president as a sick man and casually responded, "Sounds good to me," when asked about a future operation, something shifted. This wasn't policy. It was permission. For Colombia, a U.S. ally, the implication was explosive. The accusation wasn't just about drugs. It was about legitimacy. President Gustavo Petro's response was unusually personal. He defended his record, his assets, his past, and then he crossed a psychological line saying he would take up arms again to defend his country. That's the moment to pay attention, because crises are not only measured in troops or sanctions, they're measured in how leaders feel cornered. Colombia suddenly found itself recast, not as a partner, but as a suspect. A country defined by a single commodity and a single failure. And when that framing takes hold, escalation becomes easier to justify. To audiences, to allies, to history. If this analysis is helping you see the pattern beneath the headlines, stay with me. Because what happened next reveals the deeper machinery behind all of this. What ties all of this together is not ideology, it's a system. At the center of Trump's rhetoric is a simple mechanism. Control the flow, control the outcome. Oil, drugs, shipping routes, nuclear capability. When Trump says the US needs Greenland, he doesn't speak of culture or consent. He speaks of strategy. When he talks about Venezuela, it's oil allowed to freely come out. Cuba is described as collapsing because its economic lifeline is gone. Mexico is framed as a corridor, drugs pouring through it. Iran is reduced to facilities that can be knocked down. This is not moral language. It is logistical language. In this framework, sovereignty becomes conditional. If a country disrupts a system the US deems vital, pressure follows. If rhetoric fails, force is implied. And if force succeeds once, it lowers the threshold everywhere else. That is the hidden shift. Power no longer needs justification after the fact. It announces itself first and dares the world to respond. And soon, the world does. The second crisis unfolded across borders, and almost all at once. Cuba was declared a regime ready to fall. Its income gone. Its ally, Venezuela, neutralized. Secretary of State Marco Rubio did an outline policy. He issued a warning. If I lived in Havana and I worked in the government, I'd be concerned. In response, Cuba's president stood before the US embassy and spoke the language of sacrifice, life, cost, alliance. At the same time, Mexico was pulled into the storm. Trump spoke of drugs pouring across the border, of cartels very strong, of having to do something. And then came the question that changed the tone entirely. Would Mexico accept US military help? President Claudia Sheinbaum's answer was firm. No intervention, no ambiguity. Notice the escalation pattern here. No troops moved, no sanctions announced. Yet multiple governments shifted into defensive posture, rhetorically, politically, psychologically. This is crisis by accumulation. Pressure without pause, signals without resolution, and when this kind of pressure builds, it doesn't stay abstract. It lands on people. This is where the story stops being about presidents and starts being about you. Because when power shifts this way, it doesn't land on conference tables. It lands on lives. If you live in Colombia, you hear the word operation and wonder what it means for your streets. If you live in Cuba, you hear ready to fall and ask how much pain comes first. If you live in Mexico, you hear talk of foreign troops and feel history pressing back in. And if you live far from all of this, you still feel it in prices, in security, in the quiet anxiety that the rules are changing. This is how geopolitics becomes personal. Not through declarations of war, but through uncertainty. You don't vote on shipping lanes. You don't negotiate oil flows. Yet your future is shaped by how casually leaders speak about force. If this resonates, pause for a moment. Share this analysis. Because understanding power is the first defense against being blindsided by it. And what's happening here doesn't stop at borders. It never does. Once pressure moves beyond borders, it stops being regional. It becomes global. When the United States speaks openly about needing Greenland, it sends a signal far beyond Denmark. It tells every small or strategically placed territory that geography is destiny and consent may be secondary. When Trump warns Iran that it could be hit very hard, the message isn't only for Tehran. It's heard in every capital watching the nuclear order fray, especially after US bombs struck Iranian nuclear facilities in June, ending already fragile talks. Here, words and action collapse into one. Allies are forced to recalibrate. Adversaries harden. Neutral states start hedging politically, economically, militarily. This is how instability spreads. not through one war, but through many calculations made at once. Greenland hears echoes of Venezuela. Iran reads the lesson of Cuba, and the world absorbs a new rule. Power is no longer patient. History shows us what comes next when deterrence becomes declarative. The future splits quickly. So let's look forward not with certainty, but with structure. Because when systems shift, the future doesn't arrive as a single outcome. It branches. The first path is the contained outcome. Rhetoric stays hot, but force remains selective. Threats deter without cascading into action. Countries adjust quietly. The system absorbs the shock, bruised but intact. The second path is the normalized intervention. Venezuela becomes precedent. Words harden into habits. Public threats make follow-through politically necessary. Each successful show of force lowers the cost of the next one. And then there is the third path, the fragmented world, where deterrence fails, where leaders misread signals, where alliances strain and smaller states arm themselves not for war, but for survival. None of these futures are chosen in a single moment. They are built sentence by sentence, decision by decision. This is the paradox of power in public. The more loudly it speaks, the fewer exits it leaves itself. And that brings us to the final question, not about Trump or America, but about the world we are now shaping. Power rarely announces its limits. It discovers them. What we've witnessed since the Venezuela strike is not chaos, it's clarity. A world where influence is spoken aloud, where pressure is applied publicly, where sovereignty is weighed against strategy. This approach feels strong, decisive, even reassuring to some, but history reminds us of something uncomfortable. Systems that rely on constant pressure must keep escalating or risk appearing weak. The question for the future is not whether the United States can act this way, it's how long the world can absorb it. If every crisis becomes a test of dominance, compromise disappears. If every sentence becomes a signal, silence becomes dangerous. Understanding this moment matters, because once rhetoric reshapes reality, stepping back is the hardest move of all. If you want to keep examining how power is changing, who holds it, how it's used, and where it leads, stay with me. Share this and watch what comes next, because the next signal is already forming.